Fair warning, I'm a huge history nerd when it comes to digging into the facts and telling things exactly as they happened. So, before I get to the part where I tell you what happened to me, I want to give you a little background on the legend itself. I hope it's not too boring, but if it is, please bear with me. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by the stories people tell in the Appalachian Mountains. I grew up surrounded by them. Around here, legends aren't just something you hear around a campfire. They're part of everyday life. They're passed from grandparents to grandchildren, whispered across front porches, repeated in old diners, and shared by people who swear they either experienced something themselves or knew someone who did. The older I got, the more I realized that these mountains have a way of holding on to their history. Some stories disappear with time, while others seem to become stronger every generation. And one thing I've learned after spending years exploring these places is that almost every legend begins with a real person. Somewhere beneath all the fear, all the rumors, and all the exaggeration, there is usually someone whose life was turned into something they never actually were. When you grow up in small, isolated communities tucked deep into the Appalachians, you also begin to notice another pattern. Throughout history, women who lived differently were almost always viewed with suspicion. If a woman preferred living alone, understood the forest better than most people, gathered medicinal plants, treated illnesses with herbs, or simply refused to live according to what everyone else expected, it rarely took long before the rumors started. Suddenly, she wasn't just knowledgeable anymore. She became strange and dangerous. People began blaming her for things that made no sense. A failed harvest, sick livestock, children getting lost in the woods, unexplained deaths. Entire communities often found it easier to point at one woman than accept that tragedy is simply part of life. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder how many of the so-called witches throughout Appalachian history were nothing more than healers, midwives, or women who understood nature far better than the people accusing them. Personally, I think modern society has done these women another disservice. Over time, we've replaced generations of traditional knowledge with products sold by enormous corporations, and somewhere along the way, we also erased the people who spent their lives learning directly from the land. I'm not saying every old remedy worked, and I'm certainly not claiming every story was completely innocent. Like any period in history, there were undoubtedly people capable of terrible things. But I do believe many women were turned into monsters simply because they lived outside what society considered acceptable. That's just my perspective, though. Everyone is free to reach their own conclusions after hearing the evidence. Because of that, I've spent years visiting places connected to some of the most infamous legends in Appalachia. I don't go there hoping to prove ghosts exist or to convince people that every local story is true. What interests me far more is understanding how those stories were born in the first place. I like digging through old records, newspaper archives, family histories, cemetery documents, and forgotten local accounts to separate actual history from folklore. Sometimes I discover that the legends are surprisingly accurate. Other times, I realize they're nothing more than generations of rumors stacked on top of one another until nobody remembers where the truth actually ended. One investigation in particular has stayed with me more than almost any other. It's the legend of the Hines Road Witch, a story that has terrified people in northeastern Alabama for decades and somehow found its way into countless books, paranormal documentaries, YouTube videos, and local ghost stories. Depending on who you ask, the witch was responsible for kidnapping children, murdering travelers, sacrificing victims inside a cave hidden in the woods, bathing in their blood, and dumping their bodies into a nearby pond that supposedly turned bright red. Other people claim she summoned enormous black hellhounds with glowing red eyes that still roam the forest at night. Some insist she cursed everyone responsible for her death after an angry mob trapped her inside her cabin and burned it to the ground. Others swear that drivers still experience unexplained car trouble on Hines Road. That thick fog suddenly appears on perfectly clear nights. That voices call people deeper into the woods, and that the witch herself still wanders near the pond, waiting for anyone reckless enough to follow her. It's an incredible story, the kind of story that immediately grabs your attention. But the more I looked into it, the more complicated it became. Almost every version contradicted the one before it. Different names kept appearing, different locations, different dates, different victims. Some people called the woman Sarah Torbett. Others insisted her last name was Torbett or Talbot. Some claimed she lived beside the pond everyone now visits. Others placed her somewhere entirely different. Even the cave connected to the legend wasn't always the same cave, depending on who was telling the story. Before long, I realized I wasn't investigating one woman anymore. I was investigating decades of overlapping rumors that had somehow merged multiple real families and real locations into one terrifying legend. What makes this story even more fascinating is that Sarah Ellen Elizabeth Torbett was actually a real person. She wasn't born in Alabama at all. She was born in 1866, eventually moved to Texas, and spent much of her life surrounded by medicine. Several of her brothers became doctors. Her husband was also a physician, and together they operated an alternative medicine practice focused on mineral springs and natural healing. Somehow, over the decades, her name became attached to a completely different story hundreds of miles away. At the same time, another woman who lived beside Clayton Pond had a large black dog known for protecting her property. A completely separate family living near another pond became tangled into the legend simply because they shared the same last name. Yet another woman who lived in a shack nearby and frightened people by yelling at trespassers also became part of the story. Piece by piece, different lives were stitched together until the original people almost disappeared, completely beneath the mythology. By the time I arrived at Hines Road myself, I honestly didn't know what I believed anymore. On paper, almost every major part of the legend seemed to fall apart under historical research. There was no reliable evidence that an angry mob burned a witch alive in 1939. There were no documented missing children connected to these families. The famous blood-red pond had perfectly ordinary explanations. Even the supposed drownings likely came from locals witnessing baptisms that regularly took place in the pond decades ago. Almost every terrifying claim seemed to have a perfectly reasonable historical origin once I started digging. And yet, despite all of that, one question refused to go away. If the legend was built almost entirely from misunderstandings, coincidences, and decades of distorted storytelling, why do so many people still insist that something is deeply wrong with that place? That's exactly what I wanted to find out. If you've ever looked up pictures of Hines Road, you'll probably notice that, at first glance, there's nothing particularly remarkable about it. The pond itself is actually fairly small compared to what most people imagine after hearing the legend. It's tucked away in a quiet part of the Appalachians, surrounded by trees, and if you had no idea about its history, you'd probably drive right past it without thinking twice. Unfortunately, over the years, the place has also attracted exactly the kind of people you'd expect. Some visitors leave trash behind, others carve symbols into the surrounding trees, or leave handwritten notes scattered around the shoreline. While I was walking around the pond that afternoon, I picked up one of those pieces of paper out of curiosity, expecting it to be another fake ritual or some teenager trying to be edgy. Instead, it contained a handwritten death threat directed at someone by name, claiming that one day they would be thrown into that very pond. It was disturbing, but at the same time, it perfectly reflected what the legend had become. People weren't just visiting because they believed the stories anymore. Some were actively using the location to fuel their own obsession. My plan couldn't have been simpler. I wasn't there looking for ghosts, demons, or anything like that. I wanted to spend the night close enough to the pond to see whether any of the stories had even the slightest basis in reality. If the water really turned red after dark, I wanted to witness it myself. If people truly heard dogs barking where no dog should exist, I wanted to hear it. If there was anything unusual about the place, I wanted to experience it firsthand instead of relying on stories passed around the internet. I wouldn't say I believe in the supernatural, but I also wouldn't say I dismiss it completely. I've always tried to keep an open mind. I prefer evidence, things that can actually be documented and verified, but I also recognize that history is full of events people couldn't explain until science eventually caught up. My grandmother used to tell me that the supernatural is only supernatural until science figures out how it works. And for some reason, that idea has always stayed with me. I had brought a small backpacking tent and decided to camp reasonably close to the pond without being directly visible from the trail. Even though the area isn't exactly crowded, people still stop by throughout the day, especially those hoping to experience something paranormal for themselves. I had no interest in spending the evening dealing with curious strangers or internet ghost hunters. I found a spot hidden by thick vegetation, pitched my tent in less than 15 minutes, organized my gear, and spent the next hour simply listening to the forest settle into darkness. The sun disappears quickly in these mountains. One minute, everything is covered in warm orange light, and the next, you're surrounded by almost complete darkness, broken only by the beam of your flashlight. I had been there for maybe an hour and a half when I heard the first scream. It immediately caught my attention because it wasn't the kind of scream someone makes while joking around or trying to scare their friends. It sounded raw, panicked, human. My heart started pounding almost instantly, and for a brief second, I even wondered whether every ridiculous story surrounding this place had somehow been true all along. I grabbed my flashlight and my sidearm, left the tent behind, and began moving through the vegetation as quietly as I could. The closer I got, the more I realized the scream had only been the loudest sound. Underneath it, there were multiple voices. Several people were talking at once, some calmly, others much louder, almost as though they were arguing over something. I moved close enough to safely look through the trees without exposing myself, and what I saw immediately convinced me that something was very wrong. There were at least a dozen people gathered together, every one of them dressed entirely in white robes that almost glowed beneath their flashlights. In the center of the group were a man and a woman lying on what looked like an improvised wooden stretcher, The man was yelling constantly, struggling against the people carrying him, while the woman barely moved at all. Whether she had fainted, been drugged, or was simply too exhausted to react, I couldn't tell. The entire scene looked like something pulled straight out of a horror movie. Nobody appeared to notice me, and I wasn't interested in finding out what would happen if they did. I backed away as carefully as I could, returned to my campsite without making unnecessary noise, and immediately grabbed the one thing I couldn't believe I'd forgotten when I first left the tent: my satellite phone. Looking back, I still have no idea why I'd left it behind. My first instinct had been to investigate, not realizing I was walking towards something that looked disturbingly organized. I contacted emergency services as quickly as I could, explained exactly where I was, described everything I'd witnessed, and stayed hidden while waiting for law enforcement to arrive. To my surprise, they got there much faster than I expected. Several patrol vehicles pulled into the access road leading toward the pond, and officers made their way into the woods. I stayed well back from the area because the last thing I wanted was for anyone in that group to recognize my face. By then, I'd already packed almost everything I owned back into my truck. There was no chance I was spending another night anywhere near that place. About half an hour later, 2 deputies walked back toward me. What they told me left me feeling relieved and deeply unsettled at exactly the same time. According to them, there was no evidence whatsoever that anyone had been assaulted or held against their will. Every single person involved insisted they were participating voluntarily in what they described as a private religious ceremony. Both individuals on the stretcher confirmed they had agreed to everything beforehand. No crimes had been committed. Nobody requested help. Legally, there was nothing the officers could do beyond documenting the encounter and making sure everyone dispersed peacefully. Part of me felt enormous relief because I'd been convinced I just witnessed a kidnapping or something even worse. Another part of me couldn't stop thinking about how incredibly disturbing the entire scene had been. A dozen people dressed in white robes. A woman who barely appeared conscious. A man screaming while being carried through the woods at night. Even if nobody had technically broken the law, nothing about what I'd seen felt remotely normal. I drove home that same night and did everything I could to put the experience behind me, convincing myself it had simply been one of those bizarre situations you occasionally stumble across while exploring remote places. I live in a pretty isolated part of Appalachia myself. My nearest neighbor is only a few minutes away on foot, but dense forest separates our properties so completely that neither of us can even see the other's house through the trees. That's fairly normal around here. Everyone knows everyone in town. We help each other whenever we need to. But once you get home, you're mostly surrounded by woods. Less than a week after that trip, someone came to my house. It was well after dark. I was sitting in my living room watching television when I heard a knock at the front door. At the time, I didn't have a security camera installed, something I'd been meaning to do for years, but kept putting off. I walked over quietly and looked through the peephole. Standing on my porch was a man dressed completely in white. He wore a plain white mask that covered his entire face, white gloves, white boots, and what looked like the same kind of robe I'd seen beside the pond. He never tried forcing the door open. He never shouted. He simply stood there perfectly still before calmly speaking through the closed door. He said he knew exactly who I was. He said he belonged to the same Christian brotherhood that had gathered on Hines Road that night. He knew I had called the police. He knew where I lived. Then he explained, in the calmest voice imaginable, that their purpose was to punish people who rejected God's path. According to him, they believed society had embraced witchcraft, devil worship, false religions, and every kind of moral corruption imaginable, and they considered it their responsibility to identify those people before God eventually judged them himself. As you can probably imagine, I was completely stunned by the audacity of someone showing up at my front door, dressed like that, calmly saying everything he had just said. And when I tell you that I knew, without the slightest doubt, that every single word was meant as a threat, I'm not exaggerating. He never actually said anything that would have gotten him arrested if I'd happened to be recording the conversation. He was careful. Every sentence was vague enough to sound almost harmless on its own, but when you put everything together, there was absolutely no question about what he was trying to communicate. He wanted me to know that they had found me. He wanted me to understand that they knew where I lived. Most importantly, he wanted me to be afraid. The only thing I could think to ask was why he was hiding behind a mask. If he believed so strongly in what he was doing, why wasn't he willing to show his face? There was a long pause before he answered. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, he told me that I didn't need to see who he was because he already knew exactly who I was. He knew my face. He knew my name. He knew where I lived. Hearing someone say those words while standing outside your home in the middle of the night changes something inside you. It stops feeling like a strange encounter and starts feeling personal. At that point, I told him he needed to leave my property immediately. I said that if he stayed another minute, I was calling the police and reporting him for criminal trespassing and harassment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply tilted his head slightly and told me to be very careful because members of the Brotherhood already knew exactly who I was. Then he said something that has replayed in my mind almost every day since. He warned me that, sooner or later, I could find myself in exactly the same position as the people I had seen at the lake. The way he said it made my stomach drop. Up until that moment, I'd still been trying to convince myself that maybe the deputies had been right, that maybe everyone there had truly been participating willingly. But hearing him say that immediately brought back the man's screams echoing through the woods that night. Those weren't the screams of someone taking part in a harmless ceremony. Without really thinking, I asked him a question that had been bothering me ever since I'd left Hines Road. Why that lake? Why perform those rituals there of all places? He seemed caught off guard for the first time since the conversation had started. He stood there silently for several seconds before finally answering. According to him, the lake attracted exactly the kind of people they were looking for. People fascinated by witches, people interested in the occult, people who glorified the devil, paganism, or anything they considered opposed to God. Then he brought up something that sent another chill down my spine. He said they knew about my investigation. He knew why I'd gone there. He told me that researching and questioning the legend was exactly the sort of behavior they believed encouraged evil, and that I needed to think very carefully about the path I was choosing, because people like me were already being watched. Once again, he never directly threatened to hurt me. He didn't have to. Every sentence carried exactly the same message. The second he walked away from my porch, I called the police. Under normal circumstances, I might have waited until morning, but this wasn't normal anymore. I specifically asked for the same deputies who had responded at Hines Road because I wanted them to understand that maybe, just maybe, what I'd witnessed out there hadn't been as harmless as everyone initially believed. They arrived fairly quickly, searched around my property, checked the surrounding roads, and took another statement from me, but whoever had been standing outside my house had vanished without leaving a trace. What frustrated me most was the response I received afterward. The deputies told me that, based on everything I'd described, the man hadn't technically committed a crime simply by coming onto my porch and attempting to share his religious beliefs. Unless they could prove he'd made a direct criminal threat or refused to leave after being instructed to do so, there wasn't much they could realistically charge him with. I also couldn't help noticing that one of the deputies seemed unusually quick to dismiss everything as nothing more than a disagreement over religion. I want to be very clear here because this part is important. I'm not trying to start any kind of religious argument. People are free to believe whatever they want, and I respect that completely. This isn't about Christianity or Catholicism. This is about a group of extremists using religion as a justification to intimidate and terrorize people. Those are two completely different things. Every belief system has fringe groups capable of terrible acts, and in my opinion, organizations like this deserve to be investigated regardless of what religion they claim to represent. It's now been almost 2 months since that first visit, and things haven't gotten better. If anything, they've escalated. I've repeatedly noticed people parked near my property watching my house for long periods of time. More than once, I've spotted individuals dressed entirely in white, standing just beyond the tree line before disappearing the moment I stepped outside. I've called the police several different times. Every single time they arrive, whoever was there is already gone. I've even reached the point where I've had to walk outside armed and order people off my property myself, something I absolutely hate doing because it's not who I am, and it's never how I wanted to live. But when strangers repeatedly show up wearing masks, watching your home, and making it clear they know exactly where you live, you eventually stop thinking about being polite and start thinking about staying alive. At this point, I honestly don't know what I'm supposed to do next. The police don't seem to have enough evidence to act. The intimidation hasn't stopped. The people responsible never show their faces, never leave enough proof behind, and never cross the line quite far enough for anyone to intervene before they disappear again. All I know is that I went to Hines Road expecting to investigate an old ghost story, and instead I stumbled into something that, in my opinion, is far more frightening than anything supernatural could ever be. Everything I'm about to tell you happened during a solo hiking trip through the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky, a little over 4 years ago. I've spent most of my adult life hiking long-distance trails, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the mountains demand respect. They don't care how experienced you are, how expensive your gear is, or how many survival courses you've taken. The moment you stop respecting them, they'll remind you exactly where you stand. That trip wasn't supposed to be anything special. I had taken a week off work because I needed to clear my head after a rough couple of months, and I wanted a trail that was quiet enough for me to spend long stretches without seeing another person. I wasn't looking for adventure. I wasn't chasing ghost stories. I certainly wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted 7 peaceful days walking through forests that felt older than civilization itself. Looking back now, I wish I had picked literally anywhere else. The first day's hike went exactly as planned. The weather was perfect, the trail was in decent condition, and I reached the first backcountry shelter a little before sunset. It was one of those old three-sided wooden shelters the Forest Service maintains for hikers. Nothing fancy, just enough to get you out of the rain if the weather turns bad. There was nobody there when I arrived, so I claimed one corner, unpacked my sleeping bag, cooked a simple dinner, and settled in to read for a while before calling it a night. By the time darkness settled over the mountains, the forest had become almost unnaturally quiet. The only sounds left were insects, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the wind moving through trees that looked like they had been standing there for centuries. Around 11 o'clock, just as I was thinking about turning in, I heard footsteps coming up the trail. A few seconds later, another backpacker appeared with a headlamp, carrying a pack that looked like it weighed almost as much as he did. He was probably somewhere in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with a thick gray beard, worn hiking boots that had clearly seen thousands of miles, and one of those faces that immediately puts you at ease. He apologized for arriving so late, asked if I minded sharing the shelter, and thanked me before even setting his backpack down. There was something incredibly genuine about him. We started talking while he unpacked his gear, and before long, it felt less like I had met a complete stranger, and more like I was catching up with someone I'd known for years. He had hiked almost every major trail in the eastern United States, and seemed to have a story for every mountain range, every abandoned fire tower, every forgotten mining town tucked away somewhere in Appalachia. He wasn't loud or dramatic. He spoke the way older mountain people often do, slowly, carefully, almost as if every story deserved to be told properly instead of rushed. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward Appalachian folklore. I admitted I'd always loved reading about old mountain legends, even if I didn't necessarily believe any of them. And that was when he smiled in a way I still remember today. It wasn't the kind of smile someone gives because they're about to scare you. It was more like someone remembering a story they'd been carrying around for most of their life. He told me there was one legend his grandfather had refused to tell inside the house because he believed saying its name indoors invited bad luck. He laughed at himself before admitting he never believed that part, but he still found himself avoiding it out of habit. Then he leaned back against one of the shelter posts and began telling me about the Talipo. According to him, the story dated back generations in these mountains, long before paved roads or state parks existed. It wasn't really a ghost story, at least not in the traditional sense. It was more of a warning disguised as folklore. The legend claimed that a hunter living alone deep in the mountains had returned home one winter evening with almost no food left. As night fell, a strange animal wandered into his cabin. Nobody could agree what it actually looked like because every version described it differently. But everyone agreed on one thing. It had an unusually long, thick tail. Desperate for something to eat, the hunter killed the creature, chopped off its tail, and cooked it over the fire. It was the only meal he had left. That night, just as he drifted off to sleep, he heard something outside his cabin. At first, it sounded like leaves scraping across the ground, then branches snapping, then footsteps circling the cabin over and over again. Finally came a voice. Quiet at first, almost impossible to make out, but slowly becoming clearer every time it passed beneath the windows. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't growling. It sounded patient, calm, almost polite. It repeated the same sentence again and again, asking who had taken its talipo. The following night, the voice came back, this time closer, louder. It wandered around the cabin for hours, repeating those same words without ever changing its tone. By the third night, the footsteps reached the front porch. The voice was no longer outside, somewhere in the darkness. It was standing directly beyond the door. According to every version of the legend, the hunter was eventually found missing without a trace. The only thing left behind inside the cabin was the fireplace, still warm, and claw marks running across the wooden floor toward the door. He explained that parents had been telling children that story throughout Appalachia for generations. On the surface, it sounded like a simple monster tale meant to scare kids into behaving, but older mountain families viewed it differently. To them, the talipo represented greed, disrespect for nature, and the belief that taking something which doesn't belong to you always comes with consequences. His grandfather used to say that the creature itself wasn't even the frightening part. The frightening part was the certainty with which it came back. It never forgot. It never forgave. It simply kept searching until it found exactly what had been taken from it. He chuckled after finishing the story and admitted he hadn't thought about it in years, then wished me a good night, rolled into his sleeping bag, and within minutes I could hear him snoring softly. I don't know whether it was the story itself or simply the atmosphere of those mountains, but I remember lying awake much longer than I normally would. Every ordinary sound seemed just a little more noticeable after that. A squirrel moving through leaves sounded heavier than it should have. Wind brushing against branches almost resembled footsteps if I let my imagination wander too far. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up just before sunrise, the shelter was empty. At first, I assumed he'd already packed up and continued hiking. There was nothing particularly strange about that. Plenty of backpackers start before daylight to avoid hiking during the hottest part of the day. Still, something felt off. His entire sleeping area was spotless, almost unnaturally so. There wasn't a single footprint in the damp dirt behind the shelter where he'd unpacked his gear the night before. No coffee smell lingering in the air. No sound of someone walking away on the trail. It was simply as though he'd vanished between the moment I fell asleep and the moment I opened my eyes. I shrugged it off because there wasn't really another explanation, packed my own gear, and continued down the trail, telling myself I was letting an old campfire story get inside my head. The rest of that day went smoothly, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. It wasn't because I believed anything supernatural had happened. It was because I realized how unusual it was that someone I'd spent nearly 2 hours talking with could disappear so completely without leaving behind the slightest sign he'd ever been there. Every now and then, I'd catch myself looking farther down the trail, expecting to see him again. I never did. By late afternoon, I reached another shelter several miles away, cooked dinner, watched the sun disappear behind endless ridges, and settled in for another quiet night. Nothing unusual happened, at least nothing I could point to. There were moments when I'd glance into the woods because I thought I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision, but every time it turned out to be nothing more than branches moving in the wind. Once or twice, I had the uncomfortable feeling that someone was standing deeper in the trees watching me. Yet whenever I actually looked, there was nothing there. I blamed the story. That's exactly what stories like that do. They plant a tiny seed in the back of your mind, and suddenly every perfectly ordinary forest noise feels slightly different. By the third evening, I had almost convinced myself I'd been ridiculous. I'd covered another long stretch of trail, reached a small shelter overlooking a narrow valley, made myself dinner, and even laughed at how much that old legend had gotten under my skin. Around midnight, I woke up because I needed to use the bathroom. Anyone who spent enough time backpacking knows the routine. You grab your flashlight, walk a safe distance away from camp, do what you need to do, and head straight back before your body fully realizes how cold the night actually is. I had barely stepped beyond the edge of the shelter when I heard it. The voice wasn't loud. If anything, it was so quiet that I almost convinced myself it had come from somewhere inside my own head. It drifted through the trees from somewhere downhill, calm enough that it never sounded like shouting, yet clear enough that there was absolutely no mistaking the words. It slowly asked who had taken its talipo. Every hair on my arm stood up before I even processed what I'd heard. I didn't shine my flashlight toward the trees. I didn't call out. I didn't investigate. Every instinct I had told me to get back inside that shelter immediately. As I turned around, I caught the unmistakable feeling that something farther down the slope had shifted, not running, not charging, just moving quietly. The woods had become completely silent. Even the insects had stopped. I climbed back into my sleeping bag, fully dressed, kept my flashlight in one hand for the rest of the night, and never slept another minute. At first light, I packed faster than I ever have on any hiking trip before or since. I skipped breakfast, ignored the rest of my planned route, hiked straight back to my truck, and drove home without making another stop. I've replayed that night in my head countless times over the years. Maybe another hiker knew the story and decided to play a cruel joke. Maybe I dreamed the entire thing while I was half asleep. Maybe my brain mixed that old man's story with ordinary forest sounds and created something that never happened. Every explanation seems reasonable until I remember how unmistakably human that voice sounded, and how impossible it is to mistake those particular words after hearing the legend only 2 nights earlier. I still hike the Appalachian several times a year because I refuse to let one experience ruin something I've loved my entire life. Even so, whenever someone I've never met starts talking about old mountain folklore around a campfire, I politely listen, wish them a good night, and make sure I'm hiking again before sunrise. Some stories belong in books, some belong around campfires, and every now and then you walk away wondering whether one of them followed you farther down the trail than you realized.